All right, so let's dive into this whole ELN in Venezuela thing.
Yeah, it's a pretty wild situation, right?
You've given us like a ton of articles, reports, even some firsthand accounts. It's crazy.
There's a lot to unpack.
Yeah, so we're going to try and break it all down, like what's actually important here.
Distill it down to the essentials.
Right, so we're talking about Colombia's last active guerrilla group, major player on that Colombia-Venezuela border. But what's really caught our attention is their like expansion deeper into Venezuela.
Almost like they're going binational.
Yeah, they're going binational. So how did this even happen?
Well, it's a fascinating evolution to see.
What are their goals? Like, why should we care about a guerrilla group potentially thousands of miles away?
Right. I think to really understand it, we need to go back to the beginning.
Okay, so origin story time.
Exactly. Got to look at how this group even came to be in the first place.
Help me out here. What led to the ELN's formation? I mean, were they always meant to be this cross-border force?
Not necessarily right from the start, but you can definitely see how their early history kind of set the stage.
Okay, so what was going on back then?
So picture Colombia in the 1960s.
Oh, okay.
Intense political and social upheavals, student movements, religious fervor, and a big dose of inspiration from the Cuban Revolution.
Oh, yeah, Cuba was a big deal back then.
Huge. And a lot of people, especially the younger generation, were disillusioned with the status quo.
So basically, a recipe for radicalization.
Exactly. And one thing that really jumped out at me when I was going through all this material was this detail about their early training grounds at San Vicente de Chucurí.
San Vicente de Chucurí, huh? Doesn't sound super familiar.
Right. You wouldn't think it's that important, but it is.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's so special about it?
Well, it's right near the Venezuelan border,
Oh, interesting.
nestled in these mountains, perfect for guerrilla training.
Ah, so from the very beginning, they were operating in terrain that would later become crucial to their whole cross-border thing.
Exactly. It's like they were unknowingly prepping for this binational role all along.
It's like fate or something.
In a dark and twisty kind of way, yeah.
Uh-huh, yeah.
And being in that border region so early on meant they could connect with local communities, you know?
Right, building those relationships.
Some folks were sympathetic to their cause. Those connections would be super valuable later on,
I can see how that would come in handy.
especially when they started needing refuge in Venezuela.
Okay, so that makes sense. They're training in this border region, getting to know the land, making connections. But how did they actually end up in Venezuela? Was it like a grand plan or more of a, hey, let's cross the border and see what happens kind of thing?
It was more out of necessity at first.
Like fleeing.
Yeah. They needed to escape the pressure from the Colombian government.
Okay.
In the 1980s, they started using Venezuelan territory, particularly a pure state, as like a safe haven.
Pure. Got it.
But Venezuela wasn't exactly thrilled to have them there.
I can imagine that. You can't just show up in another country with a bunch of armed guerrillas and expect a welcome party.
Right. It was definitely a tense relationship right from the start.
So there was pushback.
Oh, yeah. One of the sources even mentions a 1995 incident where the ELN killed 8 Venezuelan Marines.
Oh, wow. That's definitely not going to win you any friends.
Talk about a diplomatic nightmare.
Yeah, not a good look. So they're seeking refuge, but also causing trouble. How did Venezuela respond to that?
Well, in 98, under President Rafael Caldera,
Okay.
they actually allowed Colombian forces to cross the border to go after the ELN.
Wow, so they were serious about kicking them out.
Definitely trying to limit their presence and influence, you know.
So not exactly a safe haven at that point.
Nope. But then everything changed.
Enter Hugo Chavez.
You got it.
Yeah.
1999, Chavez is elected, and it's a total game changer.
Why is that? I mean, I know Chavez was a bit of a controversial figure,
Oh, yeah, for sure.
but how did his election impact the ELN?
Well, Chavez had a more ideologically aligned view of the ELN. He saw them as fellow revolutionaries in a way.
Interesting.
Plus, his policies were more relaxed when it came to border security.
Ah, so things got a little cozier for the ELN in Venezuela once Chavez came on the scene.
Definitely made things easier for them.
But at this point, they're still mainly laying low, right? When do they really start to transform into this major force they are today?
That shift really picks up speed around 2016.
Okay, what happened then?
The FARC, their main rivals in the region, sign a peace deal with the Colombian government.
Ah, so this creates a power vacuum.
Huge power vacuum.
Yeah,
It was basically a golden opportunity for the ELN to step up and flex their muscles.
makes sense.
And this is where it's really important to understand the Colombia-Venezuela border. We're not talking about just some arbitrary line on a map.
Right, I know it's a hotbed for all sorts of activity.
Exactly. This region is a maze of smuggling routes, a hub for drug trafficking, It's like the Wild West down there.
So suddenly, being in Venezuela isn't just about hiding out anymore.
Nope.
It's about controlling valuable territory, tapping into these criminal networks.
Exactly. And that's where they start to transform from a relatively small guerrilla group into this powerhouse we see today.
It's wild how they've leveraged that situation to their advantage.
It is.
And they're not just hiding in a few camps anymore either, right?
Oh, no, not at all. Insight Crime, their leading organization that studies organized crime, they've actually documented the ELN operating in at least 40 municipalities across 8 Venezuelan states.
40 municipalities.
Yep. It's a massive expansion. We're talking Zulia, Táchira, Amazonas. It's starting to sound less like a Colombian group and more like a Venezuelan one, you
I
know?
was just thinking that.
It's really interesting how they've taken advantage of all the political and economic instability in Venezuela, embedded themselves deeply within the country.
Okay, so they're spreading out, they're growing, but what are they actually doing there? How are they flexing their muscles, so to speak?
Well, it's a pretty wide range of activities, shall we say.
Give us the inside scoop.
They're heavily involved in, of course, drug trafficking, controlling those key smuggling routes.
Right, moving product.
Exactly, and they're facilitating the movement of narcotics throughout the whole region. It's like they've created this illicit pipeline that stretches from the coca fields of Colombia all the way to the streets of cities around the globe.
And they're not just like middlemen, right? They're involved in every stage of the process, from production to distribution.
Oh, absolutely. They are deeply embedded in the whole supply chain, from controlling coca growing areas to overseeing processing labs to managing transportation routes and forging those connections with international criminal organizations.
So they're basically running the whole show from start to finish.
Yeah, a vertically integrated criminal enterprise, if you will.
Wow, that's a pretty apt description.
I try, and all that money generated from the drug trade that fuels their expansion, their ability to arm themselves, to recruit more fighters, to exert their influence within those communities.
Speaking of influence, one of the things I came across that was really disturbing, it was a report on the ELN's involvement in the heroin trade.
Oh.
They're targeting these vulnerable communities, especially indigenous populations,
Taking advantage of them.
using coercion and intimidation to get them to grow poppies for heroin production.
Horrible, really.
Yeah, it's really a horrific exploitation of people who are already struggling
Yeah, they prey on desperation.
and offering a way to make money.
But in reality, it just traps them in this cycle of poverty and violence.
It's just a reminder that all of these actions, they have very real human consequences.
Absolutely.
They're not
No.
just, abstract figures in a news report. They're causing tangible harm to real people.
That's important to remember.
It is, for sure.
And that harm, it goes beyond just the drug trade, too. They're also heavily involved in illegal mining, which is, well, it's devastating the environment.
Right. That's having a huge impact on the health of communities.
Absolutely. Are you thinking of the Orinoco mining arc in Venezuela,
That's the one.
where they use mercury to get the gold out?
Yeah, poisoning the rivers and everything.
Exactly. It's incredibly destructive.
And so short-sighted, like they're leaving behind this toxic legacy
It's hard to believe they're doing it.
for generations to come.
Just for a quick profit.
So they're profiting from misery, they're destroying the environment, and somehow they still try to present themselves as these Robin Hood figures, fighting for the poor and oppressed.
What's crazy? They're very good at propaganda. Got to give them that.
It's a remarkable feat.
Exploiting those grievances.
Yeah, let's shift gears a bit.
Sure.
I want to talk about those clashes that happened earlier this year, the Catatumbo clashes. It was a brutal reminder of, the violence and instability that the ELN brings.
Absolutely. Over 80 people killed, so many more displaced.
Yeah, it really sent shockwaves through the whole region.
And it really showed how ruthless they can be.
The thing that really struck me was that this fighting wasn't against the Colombian government. It was against another FARC dissident group, right?
Right. It was a battle for control.
Like a turf war.
Totally. Over drug trafficking routes. It was a bloody battle for territory and profits.
And it highlights how fractured these armed groups are.
Yeah. They're constantly shifting alliances.
Just jockeying for power.
And this had major implications for the peace talks with the Colombian government, didn't it?
Oh, right. The peace talks. Yeah, those were put on hold indefinitely.
Yeah, the Colombian government basically saw those clashes as proof that the ELN wasn't really committed to peace,
Makes sense, I guess.
that they were just using the negotiations to cover up their violent activities.
It's definitely a setback. Do you think it's a fatal blow to the peace process, though?
It's really hard to say.
I mean, peace processes are always long and messy, right?
Exactly. Lots of twists and turns.
But this incident, It definitely raises some doubts about the ELN's willingness to, like, actually lay down their arms and engage in a meaningful dialogue.
Definitely makes you wonder.
Okay, so we've talked about their criminal activities, they're involved in the drug trade, their brutal tactics. But I think we should also talk about their propaganda, their attempts to control the narrative.
Yeah, they're very good at that.
How do they do it? I mean, I know they have those radio stations, but what else?
They understand how powerful narratives can be,
Right.
and they've put a lot of effort into creating their own media outlets,
Mm.
spreading their message, and, well, controlling the flow of information in areas where they have influence.
It's all about shaping perceptions.
Yeah, they want to control what people think, how they see the world.
You mentioned earlier that they've even infiltrated the distribution of CLA boxes, which is crazy.
Oh, yeah, that's a brilliant move, albeit a cynical one.
Right. It's like they're controlling the narrative at a very basic level.
Exactly. They position themselves as these providers, protectors, almost like a de facto government in some areas.
Taking advantage of the weaknesses of the Venezuelan state
Oh, yeah, they're inserting themselves into people's lives.
and controlling what information they receive.
It's really a chilling example of how a group can use propaganda to build their power.
And legitimize their actions.
It makes it so hard for people to challenge their authority, to seek help from outside sources.
Okay, so they're controlling the narrative, they're getting rich through all these illicit activities, they're gaining power.
Right.
What does this all mean for Venezuela?
It's a very precarious situation full of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack.
Definitely. The ELN being there poses a serious challenge to the stability of the whole region.
Right, it's not just Venezuela at stake here.
Exactly. Their involvement in drug trafficking, all the other criminal activities, it fuels violence, corruption, instability.
It's like a cancer spreading through the region.
And their relationship with the Venezuelan government, it's so unclear.
Yeah, are they allies? Rivals? Frenemies?
We don't really know, and that makes it hard to predict how things will unfold.
It's a delicate balancing act for sure.
Yeah, and raises a lot of questions about what this means for the long term.
All right, well, we've got this picture of the ELN expanding their influence, amassing wealth, but who's actually running the show? Are we talking like a centralized leadership structure, or is it more decentralized?
They're definitely organized, but with a lot of autonomy given to the regional commanders.
Interesting.
It's a hierarchy, but a flexible one.
Ah, so they can adapt quickly, take advantage of opportunities as they arise?
Exactly. It's a very effective structure for what they're doing.
So who are the big names our listeners should know? The puppet masters behind this whole operation, so to speak?
Well, at the very top, you got Eliezer Chamorro, but he goes by Antonio Garcia.
Antonio Garcia,
He's the current leader calling the shots.
the big boss man.
Exactly. And then you have Israel Ramirez Pineda, a.k.a. Pablo Beltran.
Pablo Beltran, got it.
He's been key in the peace talks with Colombia, which is, well, it adds another layer to all this.
Peace talks, they're trying to negotiate peace in Colombia while simultaneously expanding their empire in Venezuela.
It does seem a bit contradictory, doesn't it?
It really makes you question their true intentions.
It does. Are those peace talks genuine, or are they just a way to buy time, deflect pressure? It's definitely something to think about.
Okay, so we've got Antonio Garcia running the show, Pablo Beltran doing the peace talk dance. Anyone else we should be keeping tabs on?
There's one more figure who's important, especially in Venezuela.
All right, hit me.
Gustavo Anibal Giraldo, also known as Pablito.
Pablito, okay, that's a memorable one.
He runs the Eastern War Front, responsible for a lot of what's happening on the border and inside Venezuela.
Sounds like a busy guy.
He is, and he's actually wanted by Interpol.
Wanted by Interpol, okay. This Pablito sounds like trouble with a capital T.
Yeah, definitely not someone you want to run into.
So he's in charge of the Eastern War Front, which tells us a lot about where their strategic focus is, right?
It does.
It also seems like they're not too picky about who they work with.
In this world, sometimes you have to make strange deadfellows.
I guess so.
I'm seeing reports of them teaming up with some ex-FARC dissidents.
Right, but they're also fighting with other FARC dissidents. It's confusing.
It's a very complex landscape, lots of shifting alliances and rivalries.
Can you break it down a bit for us?
The FARC dissident groups, they're not all on the same page.
Okay,
Some are trying to uphold the peace deal, others are totally against it.
got it.
And some are just focused on making money, by any means necessary.
So the ELN is kind of navigating this chaos, making alliances when it suits them, picking fights when they have to.
That's a good way to put it. They're very strategic, always looking for an edge.
So it's not just a simple us versus them situation. It's a lot messier than that.
Much messier. And then you add in their relationship with the Venezuelan government.
Right. That adds another layer of complexity.
It does.
So it's like this three-dimensional chess game, multiple players, hidden agendas, shifting alliances.
Exactly. It takes a lot of careful analysis to even begin to understand it all.
So we've got this picture of a group that went from seeking refuge to building this whole criminal empire.
Yeah, playing a dangerous game of political chess.
It's a fascinating story and honestly a little terrifying.
It is, and it's still unfolding.
Yeah, and the consequences are huge.
Potentially massive.
For Venezuela, Colombia, the whole region, really.
Exactly.
And we're just scratching the surface here.
There's a lot more to uncover.
Yeah, especially when it comes to the human cost of all of this. That's a whole other chapter.
Definitely a story that needs to be told.
Okay, so we've got this picture of the ELN entrenched in Venezuela, playing a long game, and impacting a whole lot more than just those two countries. What's wild is that they're doing all of this while also engaging in peace talks with the Colombian government. It's like they're living in two worlds at once.
It's one of the most perplexing aspects of this situation, really. How can a group be committing atrocities, expanding their criminal empire, undermining a sovereign nation, and simultaneously try to present themselves as this legitimate political force that's seeking peace?
It makes my head spin a bit. Is it possible they're playing both sides? Like using the peace talks to gain legitimacy and deflect international pressure while they just continue their operations in Venezuela?
I think it's a valid concern, for sure. The timing of it all, their expansion coinciding with those peace talks, it raises serious questions. Are they genuine about wanting peace, or is it a tactic? It's a puzzle, and something our listeners will have to consider.
Okay, so let's say, for argument's sake, they are interested in peace, at least in Colombia. What would a successful peace process even look like here? I mean, can you really just shake hands and call it a day when you've got a group so deep in criminal activity, not just in Colombia, but in Venezuela too?
It wouldn't be simple, that's for sure. A real peace agreement, it would require a complete transformation of the ELN, renouncing violence, dismantling those criminal networks, and a commitment to becoming a legitimate political force.
That sounds like a huge ask, especially given their history. I mean, over 5 decades of fighting, they've amassed a fortune through illegal activities, and they've got this deeply ingrained culture of violence and impunity.
It would be tough, no doubt, but not impossible. There are examples of armed groups laying down their arms and successfully reintegrating. It takes strong leadership from both the ELN and the Colombian government, a willingness to compromise, and a commitment to tackling the root causes of the conflict.
And a whole lot of trust, which seems to be in short supply these days.
Trust is key, absolutely. But building that trust when there's been so much violence, betrayal, broken promises, that's a monumental task.
Okay, so let's imagine that ELN does lay down its arms in Colombia. What happens to their operations in Venezuela? They can't just pack up and go home. They've built a mini empire there.
That's the big question, right? Their presence in Venezuela is so tied to the country's crisis, it's hard to picture them just disappearing.
Right, they've become a part of Venezuelan society, for better or worse. Providing services, controlling resources, wielding power. They're not going to vanish overnight.
And it really depends on what happens politically in Venezuela. If Maduro stays in power, he might see the ELN as useful, a source of stability even.
But if Maduro falls, a new government might see them as a threat, something that needs to be eradicated.
Exactly. New leadership in Venezuela could completely change the game for the ELN.
It's like we're watching this high-stakes poker game, and the ELN's fate is on the line.
Great analogy. And the outcome affects way more than just those two players. It has implications for the whole region.
Okay, so we've talked about the peace talks, the politics in Venezuela, but what about the rest of the world? What are other countries doing about the ELN threat, both in Colombia and Venezuela?
Well, the international community has been more and more vocal, condemning the ELN's actions. Several countries have labeled them as terrorists, imposed sanctions, and supported Colombia's efforts to combat them.
But it feels like there's some disagreement on how to approach this, right? Some want a negotiated settlement, others want a stronger response.
Yeah, there's no easy answer. This division reflects how complicated the situation is. Some countries, especially those in the region, they're hesitant about military intervention. They worry it'll make things worse, make the region even more unstable.
And others are worried that negotiating will just make the ELN stronger, let them legitimize all their criminal activities. It's tough to find the right balance.
It really is. This is where I think our listeners can dig in and think critically. What are the risks of each approach? Are there ethical concerns? What should the international community's role be?
Those are big questions. No easy answers, for sure.
Right. This isn't a problem with a simple fix. It needs a multifaceted solution.
And that means we need to look beyond the violence, the criminal stuff, and ask, like, why does the ELN even exist?
Exactly. They've thrived on these social and economic problems.
Right.
Poverty, inequality, lack of opportunity. That's how they recruit, gain support, justify what they do. A lasting solution has to address those root causes, building a more just society.
Okay, so we've talked about the ELN's past, their present, the possible futures. But before we wrap up, I want to bring it back to something that often gets lost: the human cost.
It's so important to remember that these aren't just headlines and statistics. These are real people whose lives have been shattered by what the ELN is doing.
We've mentioned it, but it's worth repeating. There's real human suffering happening every day. Communities ripped apart, families forced from their homes, individuals scarred by what they've seen.
And the psychological toll is immense. We talked about child soldiers, but there are so many others who've been victims. Violence, extortion, forced recruitment.
Even if they haven't been directly targeted, people are living in fear, afraid to speak up, afraid to challenge anything, afraid to just live their lives.
It creates a climate of distrust. It makes it nearly impossible to build anything positive.
So as we finish up, I want to leave our listeners with a sense of hope. Even in the midst of all this, there are people working to make a difference.
Absolutely. There are people providing aid, advocating for human rights, promoting peace, helping those who've been hurt. It's difficult, often dangerous work, but it matters.
And their stories show us that even when things are incredibly tough, there's still hope. The human spirit is strong.
Couldn't agree more.
All right, so we've dug deep, but we've really just begun to explore this complicated issue. We've looked at the ELN's history, their goals, their methods, the effects on Colombia and Venezuela, the possible futures. But we've also talked about the human cost and the people fighting for a better world.
It's been a really thought-provoking conversation and honestly a bit disheartening at times.
It has. But we hope it's sparked some curiosity, given you some insights to think about, to maybe even get involved and help those working towards a better future for everyone.
It's been a pleasure, as always.
Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep. So we're talking about a group that's really good at adapting, at seizing opportunities.
Oh yeah, they're masters at exploiting chaos, turning it to their advantage.
And right now, there's a lot of chaos to go around, especially with all the political uncertainty in Venezuela.
Absolutely, and that makes predicting the future tricky. But I think we can look at some key factors that'll shape what happens next, with the ELN and the region as a whole.
Okay, so what are the big question marks here? What should our listeners be paying attention to as this story unfolds?
Well, the most obvious one is the whole political situation in Venezuela.
Right. Maduro's grip on power seems to be slipping.
It does, and there's growing unrest, which creates a lot of instability.
So if or when Maduro falls, what happens to the ELN?
Good question, and it's tough to answer definitively.
I mean, do they lose their protector? Or do they somehow get even stronger in the chaos?
It could go either way, honestly.
That's a little unsettling.
It is. On one hand, a new government might decide to track down on them, try to push them out.
Seeing them as a liability, a remnant of the old regime.
Exactly.
But on the other hand,
they could use that chaos, that power vacuum, to dig in even deeper.
Wow, so the stakes are incredibly high.
They are.
Venezuela's political future could have a huge impact on the ELN, and vice versa.
It's a two-way street, that's for sure.
And then there's the whole peace talks situation, right, with Colombia.
Right, it's another big one.
Last we heard, those were suspended.
After those Catatumbo clashes, yeah.
A major setback.
It was.
Do you think there's any chance of reviving those talks? Or is that just a pipe dream at this point?
Honestly, it's hard to tell.
I mean, some people probably think it's a lost cause, that the ELN can't be trusted.
Yeah, there's definitely that sentiment out there.
Especially after what happened.
But there are also those who believe that dialogue is the only way forward.
That even a slim chance of peace is worth pursuing.
It's a complex issue, for sure.
With no easy answers. So we've got Venezuela's political turmoil, the peace talks in limbo. Anything else our listeners should be keeping an eye on?
The regional dynamics are crucial too, I think.
Right, because this isn't just a Colombia-Venezuela problem anymore.
Nope.
The ELN's actions are having ripple effects throughout Latin America.
Especially for countries that share a border with Venezuela.
It's like a virus. It can spread so
A
easily.
very apt analogy.
Hmm.
We could see violent spillover, instability spreading.
That's especially worrying for places like Colombia, where the ELN already has a foothold.
Right, and for countries like Brazil, with that huge porous border they share with Venezuela.
So it's a regional security challenge, not just a local one.
Exactly. And it needs a coordinated response from the international community.
Okay, so we've got this web of interconnected factors. Politics, peace talks, regional dynamics. It's almost overwhelming.
It is a lot to take in.
Can you give us any potential scenarios, like plausible paths this whole situation might take?
I think it helps to consider a few broad scenarios, but keeping in mind that reality rarely follows a neat script.
Okay, let's hear them.
One possibility is that the ELN manages to solidify its position in Venezuela, becomes even more embedded in the country's structures.
So they basically become a state within a state.
Exactly. That's more likely if Maduro stays in power, or if a new government can't or won't challenge them.
That's a scary thought.
It is.
Another scenario is that things get even more violent, more fragmented.
That's definitely possible, especially if the ELN faces a serious challenge, whether from within Venezuela or from rivals.
So we could see more clashes like those in Catatumbo?
Potentially more bloodshed, more displacement, more instability.
And then, of course, there's the most hopeful scenario,
The one where a genuine peace process takes root.
both in Colombia and Venezuela.
Right, a scenario where the ELN lays down its arms, transitions into a legitimate political force.
It's hard to imagine that happening, but we can hope.
We can. It would take major concessions from all sides, a real commitment to peace.
And a level of trust that's hard to fathom right now.
Trust is always fragile, especially in situations like this.
So those are the three big possibilities: consolidation, fragmentation, or peace.
And right now, it feels like we're at a crossroads. Any of those paths could be the one we end up taking.
It's a sobering thought.
It is. The choices that are made by the ELN, by the Venezuelan government, by the Colombian government, by the international community, those choices will determine which path we go down.
It's a lot of responsibility, and it highlights how important it is for everyone to stay informed, to understand the complexities of this situation, and to engage in thoughtful dialogue about how to move forward.
Absolutely. Awareness is crucial.
All right, before we wrap things up, I want to make sure we highlight the key takeaways for our listeners.
Yeah, let's distill it down to the essentials.
We've covered so much today. What are the points they should really remember?
Well, first and foremost, the ELN is not just Colombia's problem anymore. They're a major force in Venezuela, and their influence is spreading throughout the region.
And their expansion, it's been driven by this perfect storm of factors.
Right, you've got the political and economic crisis in Venezuela, weak institutions, and the ELN's ability to exploit all of that.
And what they're doing is having a devastating impact.
Fueling violence, corruption, environmental damage, human rights abuses.
It's a grim picture.
It is. And their involvement in the drug trade. That has global consequences.
Right. Those drugs end up everywhere, contributing to so many problems.
Addiction, crime, violence. It's a global issue now.
And the tactics they're using, it's like a playbook for how to destabilize a region.
Controlling resources, manipulating systems, spreading propaganda, taking advantage of vulnerable people. It's all very calculated.
And it's created a humanitarian crisis of immense proportions.
People are being displaced, violence is rampant, the rule of law is breaking down.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? There are people working to counter all of this.
Absolutely. There are people doing incredible work, providing aid, defending human rights, promoting peace.
Their stories are truly inspiring.
They are. And they remind us that even in the darkest of times, there's always hope.
Okay, so we've talked about the past, the present, the potential futures, and it's a lot to process. But ultimately, the future of this conflict, it hinges on the choices that are made.
By individuals, by governments, by the international community.
So it's a call to action, in a way.
It is.
To stay informed, to engage in these difficult conversations, and to support those who are working for a better future.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that about wraps things up for this deep dive.
It's been a journey.
A fascinating one, albeit a bit heavy at times, but we hope you've learned something, that you'll continue to explore this issue.
And that you'll remember the human cost of this conflict. The individuals whose lives have been turned upside down.
Exactly. They deserve our attention, our empathy, our support.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us, and until next time, keep diving deep.
Take care.